This is the night everyone loves. The grill is going. The flags are out. The sky is about to light up in red, white, and blue, and for one night a year, an entire country looks up at the same sky together. Now let me tell you what this night actually used to look like. For over 50 years, doctors, newspapers, and the United States government openly referred to the 4th of July as the deadliest day on the American calendar. Not the most dangerous holiday. The most dangerous day. Worse than New Year's Eve. Worse than Halloween. In some years, statistically more lethal than entire military engagements happening at the exact same time. Children lost fingers. Lost eyes. Lost their lives. In a single afternoon. In their own backyards. Celebrating the birth of their own country. And almost nobody alive today knows it happened. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how a national celebration became a documented public health crisis, and why it took the deaths of hundreds of children, year after year, before anyone in power was willing to do something about it. I promise you, the numbers get worse before they get better. Let's go! To understand how this happened, you have to understand what July 4th actually looked like in 19th century America. And it was nothing like what you picture. There were no professional pyrotechnic crews. No permits. No safety perimeters. No regulations of any kind. What there was, instead, was gunpowder. Lots of it. Sold openly, cheaply, and without restriction to anyone who wanted it, including children. Towns celebrated independence with literal artillery. Real cannons, fired into the air, sometimes loaded improperly by enthusiastic amateurs with no training whatsoever. Homemade explosives were common. Firecrackers were sold in bulk at general stores, with zero quality control, meaning the gunpowder ratios inside them were wildly inconsistent. Some duds, some far more powerful than intended. And here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. Toy pistols loaded with blank cartridges were marketed specifically to children, as a way to celebrate the holiday. They were sold by the millions. Cheap. Unregulated. Marketed in catalogs with cheerful illustrations of boys running through the streets, firing them into the air. Those blank cartridges were not as harmless as the word blank suggests. And what happened next, year after year, is the part of this story that genuinely shocked even the doctors who documented it. By the late 1800s, something started showing up in American newspapers every July that you would never expect to see attached to a national holiday. Body counts. Each year, in the days following July 4th, papers across the country would publish grim tallies. How many dead? How many are maimed? How many children are blinded? It became its own genre of annual reporting, almost like a wartime casualty list, except the war was a celebration. In 1903, the Chicago Tribune began compiling and publishing an annual list specifically tracking 4th of July deaths and injuries nationwide. And the numbers were staggering. In 1903 alone, the Tribune's tally recorded approximately 466 deaths attributed to July 4 celebrations. Not over a decade. In a single year. From fireworks, toy pistols, blank cartridge wounds, and the infections that frequently followed them. But here's the number that genuinely stopped me when I found it. A significant portion of those deaths weren't from explosions at all. They were suffering from tetanus. The blank cartridges used in those toy pistols, fired at close range, often directly at another child's hand or arm as a joke, would leave small wounds packed with burnt gunpowder residue and debris. In an era before tetanus vaccination existed, those small wounds became fatal infections with horrifying regularity. Doctors at the time had a name for it. They called it lockjaw, and they saw an annual spike of it every single July, like clockwork, for decades. Children who survived the initial injury entirely fine, and who went back to playing in the street would develop muscle spasms, and rigid paralysis days or weeks later. By the time symptoms appeared, there was often nothing 19th century medicine could do. Imagine being a parent in 1905, watching your child play happily on the 4th of July, having no idea that a tiny powder burn from a toy pistol could be a death sentence weeks later. That was the reality, year after year, for an entire generation of American families. Here's where the story takes a turn, because eventually, someone decided enough was enough. It started, perhaps unexpectedly, not with politicians, but with the medical community and a handful of journalists who simply refused to let the annual death toll go unnoticed. The Journal of the American Medical Association began publishing detailed statistics on July 4th injuries specifically. Doctors who treated tetanus cases, eye injuries, burns, and amputations every summer started organizing and speaking publicly about what they were calling a genuinely preventable epidemic. In 1909, a reform movement that came to be known as the Safe and Sane 4th of July campaign began gaining real traction. Cities started experimenting with banning the private sale of fireworks entirely, replacing chaotic backyard explosions with organized, professionally run public displays. And the resistance to this was significant. Fireworks manufacturers fought back hard. They argued that personal freedom and patriotic tradition were under attack. They argued the economic impact on their industry would be devastating. Some newspapers ran editorials mocking the reform movement as overly cautious, even unpatriotic, suggesting that real Americans weren't afraid of a little gunpowder. Sound familiar? It should. Because this is the exact same pattern we've seen before in this channel's history, and the exact same pattern that plays out, again and again, whenever genuine public safety reform threatens an established industry's profits. The fight over 4th of July safety took decades. Actual decades. Some towns adopted reforms by the 1910s. Others held out until the 1930s and 40s. A handful of states didn't pass meaningful fireworks restrictions until well into the second half of the 20th century. And every single year that reform was delayed, the same predictable tragedy played out in towns across the country. I want to slow down here for a moment, because it's easy to hear decades of delay as an abstract historical fact. It wasn't abstract. It was thousands of individual children, year after year, paying the price for an industry's resistance to regulation. Public health researchers, who later reviewed the historical data, estimate that in the worst recorded years, particularly in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, 4th of July celebrations were killing and seriously injuring more Americans annually than many natural disasters of the same era combined. Eye injuries were especially common and especially devastating. Bottle rockets and unregulated firecrackers, often held too long or thrown too late, caused permanent blindness in children at a rate that would be utterly unthinkable by today's safety standards. Hospitals in major cities began specifically preparing extra burn unit capacity every June, anticipating the surge that arrived like clockwork every July. And here's the detail that genuinely haunts me about this story. Much of this was completely preventable using knowledge that already existed. Tetanus prevention through proper wound cleaning was understood by the medical community well before it became standard public health practice. Basic fireworks safety standards, keeping explosives away from children, requiring trained handling, banning the most dangerous mortar-style devices for private use, were proposed repeatedly by doctors and largely ignored by lawmakers under industry pressure. The technology to prevent these deaths existed. The knowledge existed. What was missing, for decades, was the political will to act on it. That gap, between knowing and doing, is where all of those children's names belong. Names that mostly went unrecorded beyond a brief mention in a local paper's annual July casualty count. The transformation, when it finally came gradually rather than all at once. Through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, More and more American cities adopted ordinances banning the private retail sale of the most dangerous fireworks, particularly aerial mortars and high-powered firecrackers, restricting legal celebration to professionally operated public displays. The toy pistol and blank cartridge tradition that had caused so many tetanus deaths slowly faded from popularity, partly due to changing safety attitudes, and partly due to the broader rollout of tetanus vaccination in the 1940s. By the 1970s, the federal government had stepped in directly. The Consumer Product Safety Commission began regulating fireworks at a national level, banning the most dangerous classes of consumer fireworks entirely, and establishing safety standards for what remained legal. Today's professional firework displays, the kind that light up the sky over your city every July 4th, are the direct result of a century-long fight that most of the people watching them have absolutely no idea ever happened. The trained pyrotechnic teams, the safety perimeters, the weather monitoring, the licensing requirements. Every single one of those things exists because, for decades, the alternative was a body count that the country eventually decided it could no longer accept. Here's what I think this story is really about, and it's bigger than fireworks. Every safety regulation you currently take for granted was, at some point, a battle. Someone had to die, often many someones, often children, before the people with the power to change things decided the tradition, the profit, or the inconvenience wasn't worth the cost anymore. It happened with fireworks. It happened with car seatbelts. It happened with lead paint. It happened with the seemingly endless list of dangerous, ordinary things this channel exists to uncover. The pattern is always the same. Something dangerous becomes normalized because it's familiar. The danger gets documented, sometimes for decades, by doctors and researchers who are largely ignored. An industry with a financial interest in the status quo resists change, often successfully, for far longer than seems possible in hindsight. And eventually, sometimes after a genuinely tragic, almost unbearable number of preventable deaths, something shifts, and the dangerous version of normal becomes unthinkable. The fireworks display you'll watch this July 4th is safe specifically because of everything we just talked about. Because of the 466 deaths recorded in a single year. Because of the doctors who refused to stop publishing the statistics. Because of the parents who buried children on what was supposed to be the happiest day of the summer. That safety wasn't inevitable. It was fought for. So this 4th of July, when the sky lights up and everyone around you cheers, watch it the way it was meant to be watched. Safely. From a distance. Professionally operated. Exactly the way it should always have been, from the very beginning. And maybe, for just a second, think about how long it actually took to get here. If you found this story as unsettling as I did researching it, there's a lot more like it on this channel, the dark histories hiding behind the most ordinary, beloved things in our lives. Subscribe, because the next dark thing might be sitting in your own kitchen drawer right now. Happy 4th. Stay safe out there.